And so I'm writing about a half an hour a day, and I'm having a real kind of, I'm trying not to be too depressed about it. That's all I'm giving myself. So I'm kind of at the low end of output because I'm just trying to do what I can. And I'm only working on one piece. So in a way, that's good, because usually when I try and work on a lot of pieces, that's when I don't really ever have anything finished. So I'm trying to finish one piece, and I'm getting rid of the voice that's telling me you're overworking it, mainly because I'm only working it 20 to 30 minutes a day. So I don't think you can overwork something if you're only hitting it that much.
Yeah, unless it's a one sentence story that's like 9 words. I'm working 30 minutes a day on this 9-word story. It's going to be awesome.
But the other thing is, I think that it's important to update folks on the progress of the novel that I wrote last year. And go ahead and ask me how that's going. How's the progress?
So Tim, how is your novel progressing from last year? Very excited to hear about that.
I don't even remember that I wrote a novel. Are you kidding me? Where is it? I don't even know what the title is. What was it about?
It was based on a cookie sheet, I think. I don't remember.
Based on oh yes, that's right, a cookie sheet of some sort that's underneath. I'm always haunted by that novel. It's like, hey, I like this idea. I'm excited about the idea. I think it's got legs. And so I'm always like, you have got to get back to that. You can't stay away from it for too long. And so I'm just trying to figure out what ways I could possibly get back into it. Because, for folks that might not know, I've picked up this gig, this acting gig in Haley, Idaho. And it's been such a gift and such a pleasure. And I really love doing it. And a lot of the first, the rehearsal process, your brain is just taken up with all of the stuff that's in the world that you are helping to create. You're on stage and you're learning lines and where you got to stand and how the director wants you to say it. But then once you have finished and opened the show, you have scads of time because all of the lines are in your head. You've got it down pretty well. You're comfortable. You've run the show enough times that you feel like you've ironed out a lot of problems. And I think when I initially took this contract, it was a 6-week contract. I have a little private studio apartment for myself as my guest artist housing. And I was like, this is going to be great. I'm going to rewrite a second draft of Madeline Tin and the Chess King, my novel, in that time. And I just do not have the space for it because the rehearsal process is so much. And it's sort of bumming me out, but I'm trying to figure out a way that is a way back into writing the novel, but not another deflection, not another roundabout way of not really doing the work. If that makes sense?
Yeah, no, for sure. And give yourself a little bit of grace. I am not a performer. And I assume that takes a lot of energy and a lot of focus and commitment to do that. There's a small, maybe correlation in my world. I'm a training manager, and so I frequently deliver training, which is a kind of performance. And some of what you said rung true for me because once a class is developed and you've delivered it a few times and you know the pacing and, the manipulatives you need to pull out and how you're gauging whether the learner is actually learning it, it's kind of like a performance at that stage. And it's really easy to just sort of run it forward. You're like, oh, yeah, I've done this course a bunch. I know how to do it. We're good. You don't even have to prep very much. You have to look at it. You just sort of do it. And it's almost like these scripted moments kind of pop back up. Oh, right. When I talk about this concept, I say these words in this order. It's very much like a script.
Yeah.
So, it's not a true one-to-one correlation, but I think I know what you're feeling. And it's like, yeah, there's empty time, but you still need to be on for the performance. You still have to have the energy level to go do the work.
Yeah.
So if you're off and you don't have the energy level, cut yourself a break. It's okay. Maybe just pick a smaller target. That's pretty ambitious to say, I'm going to redraft my novel. For me, I've never drafted a novel ever. I tried a couple times and I've only gotten maybe a third or a half of the way through, probably a third really. So like, yeah, maybe have a smaller target. Do something that matches your energy level. We've talked about that before, where it's like, you know, starting from zero and having an empty page requires a tremendous amount of mental energy. And if you've got something and you want to edit it, that takes less. And if you've got something that's close and you want to proof it, that's even less energy that's required. So like, maybe just pick a different target and cut yourself a break.
Yeah, I do know that there are other times. I think we've even mentioned this sort of anecdote before, where Taika Waititi, the filmmaker, writes a script and then leaves it for a year. And I've heard that there are other folks that kind of do that, where they have something and they put it away for a while so that they can come back to it. And I think it's that idea is like, well, okay, well, if I do give myself the break, if I do like take it easy and say, and take it off my plate, which relieves the stress of that writing, it's like, okay, but when am I going to find the time? I'm always complaining that I don't have enough time with things, with work and, just trying to have like a regular normal life. And I don't have children like I remember maybe 10, 15, 20 years ago, I talking to a friend, and I'm just like, well, maybe you can find time to write, when the baby's asleep. And that is so ridiculously naive of me, because I've gotten rid of a lot of the prerequisites I put in front of myself to write. For example, one of the things that I did in that sort of 15 to 20 years where I wasn't writing at all, where I was too afraid to, it was like, well, the table has to be just the right height. It has to be just the right time of day. I have to have just the right amount of dishes done. I have to have the coffee in the right position on the table. I had all of these things that if they weren't right, I could, I just can't write. I just can't create in this atmosphere. And I've gotten rid of a lot of that, and I'm very, very thankful for that. But still, I do need to have a little bit of space alone, at least alone, or at least feeling like I'm alone, that I can focus on the work, because it is, such a solitary pursuit. So,
yeah. Well, I mean, when we talk about a smaller target, it's like, okay, I'm going to redraft an entire novel is a large undertaking. But if you say, well, I want to go into the book, like maybe there's a particular part of that narrative that you felt was really strong, your level of effort could be to just go there and reread it and see if it is as strong as you remember it. This is a great topic for us to discuss, which is really, how do I re-engage with a creative work that I've drafted, and now sufficient time has passed and it's time for me to go back into it, and I don't know how to do that. I'm experiencing the same thing right now, because the story Aftermath that I wrote, I need to get back into it because I want to get it over the finish line. And my friend, I thought it was a lot closer to the goal line than it is. When I drafted it, you read it, and then I redrafted it, and I'm like, I'm amazing. This thing is so great. I can't wait to win awards with this story. And then the next day, I had my phone read it to me, and I'm like, well, maybe I didn't quite land that. And then more time has passed. I want to say maybe 3 weeks at this point, and I went back to it and had my phone read it to me again, and I was just crestfallen. I'm like, oh my God, I really thought this was a lot better than what I'm hearing. Yeah. And it's just because like a lot of the potential is there, and a lot of the really interesting things that can be developed, they're in there. But I guess when I originated it, I felt like, oh, I'm really tapping into a vein of gold here. Mm-hmm. And maybe that's true, but reading it back, it's like, you have not expressed this in the most elegant and cleanest way possible. You need to go back and try again. Like, it's not as close as you thought it was. And that's a super bummer, right? I don't know if that's what you're feeling, but I definitely feel similarly that and then I'm kind of tiptoe. It's almost like the story's on eggshells. And I worry, like, if I go back in and start moving stuff around or drafting new things, am I going to screw up what's already there? So it's like not good enough already. But if I go back in, am I going to make it worse? So that's where that's kind of where I am right now. But I'm going to get over it, and I think it's worthwhile for us to talk about how to do that, how to kind of get over that initial hesitancy and get back into it.
Yeah, it's just part of that for me of getting back into a piece is, again, and I just mentioned it a couple minutes ago, there was this time after I graduated from college up until like 2015, 2016, where I was very afraid to write. And one of the things that I kept on doing was I would get the inspirato for a piece. I'd be like, this is a good idea. Let's explore this. And I would write and I would write and I would write and I would write. But the second I sort of like stepped away from it to the point where it wasn't on my mind, whether that was an hour later, a day later, or like a month or two later, I felt like I was out of that creative alleyway, that creative path that was so into the piece, when all of the gears seemed like clear and present to me in front of me in my head. And I was like, oh, this is catching the muse, as we would say. I got to capture this. And I would never, maybe people have this, but I rarely have the opportunity to sit down with a piece, write it all the way through, and be like, that's everything that I wanted to think about this piece right here. And so once I get out of that, it's very, very difficult for me to get back into it. It's always a struggle to be like, oh, when I was writing this, I remember the coffee had just hit me right. The creativity was there. The inspiration was there. The caffeine was there. Oh, I'm not yet. And I would just throw my hands up in the air and say, nope. Well, I've lost that piece again. That's over. I've lost another piece. I'm not going to be able to get back to that spot.
I mean, I think you're right, but I think what I've learned in the last month is that you don't need to get back to that spot. Let me explain. Yeah. So the Donut Friday is the story that I read into the record. The one that I read in was the second draft. The first draft had a happier ending that was really forced and somewhat contrived. And it was interesting because when people read it and gave me feedback, they're like, this is really good, but I think it's like a start of something longer, or, they didn't feel the ending hit cleanly. And I took that to mean it's not finished. So I went back into it. And when I went back into it, I told myself, it's so wonderful that you're talking about this, Tim, because I think it's really worthwhile for us to do this. I'm like, I'm not going to be able to get back to the headspace where I was when I originally drafted this. And I also shouldn't think about the initial moment that I drafted this as the only moment in time when this could be created. So instead, I'm going to start reading it with this moment in mind. And where I find that it diverges from what I want to do now, I'm going to pivot and allow the story to change. And as a result, the back third of the story got chopped off and was replaced with a new ending. And it's like every time I went back into that story, because I've gone back into it again after the feedback session, and then I've recently started submitting it for publication, and I'm starting to collect my glorious rejections, and it's very wonderful. I'm part of the community. But every time I went back into it, trying to do something a little different, while also being true to what the piece was telling me it should be. And I would get a little closer to the target. So to me, the visual that I keep using in my head is that typical target, like, the Target store logo or an archery target, where it's got the big circle, the big red circle on the outside, then a white circle, then a smaller red circle, and a white circle, and a small red circle in the middle, which is the target. And I feel like the first draft is the big red circle on the outside. And every time I go back into it, I'm drawing a new red circle that's closer to the middle. And so I'm painting that target. Yeah. And so every time I go back, I should be getting closer to that bullseye. So how many times does it take? I think it's different for every piece. I would say at least 3, but probably however many you feel. And we talked about that whole doneness thing, remember, in a recent episode, when you feel like, yes, I would put my name on this. I would not be upset if people saw my name on this and read it, and I think it's worthy of being read. That's when it's done. And so, obviously Madeline Tin is not done. You've only done the first big chunky outside circle of the target. So I don't think you need to force yourself into the headspace where you were when you drafted it. It's unreasonable. It's unrealistic. So instead, you just kind of go in with, okay, well, I'm a smarter person now, I think you could say, because you've lived a little more life and you've written more work. So ostensibly you're better. So you go into it being better, which is just a natural response to being a person who's
Yeah.
trying to do the work. So you're better. And then you
Yeah.
come in with a different sensibility, having lived more life. Well, you can only improve it at that point. Jesus, I'm talking myself into going back into my other story. Thank you, Tim. Because it's like, you can't mess it
Next
up.
week,
I've
next
lived,
week, Art reads another story into the record because he went back.
oh man. I don't know. I don't know if the folks, yeah.
Yes, because I feel like I am 50-50, like exactly on the 50-yard line between nothing is better than looking at your piece with a fresh pair of eyes. And by fresh pair of eyes, I define that as you've forgotten the piece enough. You've had the piece out of your head. You took a trip to see the folks. You made a phone call to your best friend. You had to go to work for a couple days because it was busy. You had to get, so it's completely like swept out so that when you come back to it, just like you said, you come back to the piece and you're like, you're living in the piece, you're writing the piece, you're working on the piece, and you're like, this is it. I think we're pretty close. And then for me to have completely swept it out of my brain and to come back at it, that's very, very important to me to be like, oh. But on the other end, I want to recapture that initial spark because, as I've mentioned before, there are times when I write like something and something comes to me in the morning or I, the inspirato hits, the muse hits, and I got a little piece and I send it to my wife and she'll say, this is great. And then I'll work it a couple of days later. She'll be like, wow, you really lost what this was about. You kind of overworked this. So I'm always between the two, which means maybe I don't have to reconcile them. They both can live equally in my mind as a pursuit, but maybe trying to find myself in a space, a sort of higher plane where I am just ready to take the work as it is when I see it and say, I know what I'm going for. Let's see how we could do it. I guess to be a little bit kinder to myself and to put myself in a creative state to where I'm always ready to get back to a piece and not be so like, well, I really screwed the pooch with this one. I guess I got let's just roll up the sleeves and see what we can do.
Yeah, no, that's a really good way to say it, Tim. And I think what we're talking about, at least this is how I'm thinking about it now, is the initial inspiration for the story comes from nowhere, right? It comes from the ether and you sort of say, aha, an idea. It might come from that first line or whatever. And you draft it from that spark that we talk about. And I think if you approach the rewrite in the same way, it actually is doing you a disservice. Like you have to wait for inspiration to go back to the thing. No, I think if you read the thing, the inspiration, the spark is in there. And it'll catch and you'll start going in a slightly different direction and adding, more to it. Because it really feels like, again, this is just for me. I don't know if this is for everybody, but when I get excited about writing something, I'll just dive into it and that's all I do, right? So I draft it, I do as much as I can. And then when it's done, I feel like, this thing is fantastic. And I come back to it later and I read it and I realize it's not as fantastic as I remembered it. And I think it's because when I'm in it and really developing it for the first time, I know what potential is there. I know what it could be. And I'm really looking at it through rose-colored glasses, like, well, this is going to be awesome. When I have enough time and I go away from it long enough, come back to it, I don't have that perspective anymore. I don't know what it could be. I can only judge it for what it is. And that's why it's always worse when you come back to it, which is glorious because that's the only way the reader will experience it, is for what it is. So it's a gift that we can kind of forget what we intended. So you go back through and you read the work and go, oh, well, this part's clunky and I don't know about this. What the hell was I thinking here? But there's going to be places that are like hooks that you can kind of tie off on and go, ooh, this part's pretty good. Oh, wow. Oh, right. I remember with this, I was going to actually spin it off to do this other thing. And I feel like, reading it through and kind of making those quick notes, even just like you said, printing it and kind of circling areas where you want to linger or go back to, is how you find the spark. And then, that's the smaller circle that on that target, that works us towards the bullseye. That's what it feels like to me. I think I may have just learned that in real time as we're talking.
Well, yeah. One of the things that ends up happening for me is when I return to a piece that I've kind of, again, swept out of my head, I wish that or maybe what I need to do is learn to approach that piece as if it's someone else's piece. There are times when I'll sort of have a preciousness to the piece where I'm like, I feel a little bit like, oh, you know what? I've lost something in returning to this piece. I've lost that initial spark. I've lost the inspiration for this. That's my first thought when I reapproach a piece. But I would love to work towards just looking at the piece as if it's someone else's. Because, yes, like you said, it's almost as if I'm looking at the piece as someone who hasn't ever read it will read it. And that's very important for me because sometimes I forget I need to give the reader certain details to make the piece make sense. So yeah, I would love to lose the preciousness of it without the emotional attachment I feel to it. But being able to come back to a piece as a stranger would be so much more helpful for me than coming back to it and going, man, I remember I was on a bike ride in Idaho and I had that thought and I loved that thought and I kept on pulling out my phone and making notes and almost got into a bike accident because I was so excited about it. Man, I wish I could get back to that spot. I need to lose that. Those spots can come back through the rewrites and the exploration in the piece in rewriting it.
Yeah. For sure. Right. Problem solved. All right, go right.
Sometimes, I feel like sometimes I come to the end of an idea and I'm just sort of like, surprise you by just dropping the ball in your court and being like, and that's the end of the sentence. Right?
Right. Yeah, but I mean, what else is there to say? I think you've hit on it.
Yeah.
And actually, this has been very encouraging for me because I have a copy of Aftermath, my short story printed, and I used to never print stories. Like it had to earn its way onto paper, and I've changed my opinion on that. It's not a problem to print things. I still want to save the trees, so I don't want to print willy nilly. But this is one I'm going to work on, and I see value in actually having something I can scribble on. In a way, I think what you had just mentioned about kind of coming to it as I like to use the phrase dispassionate reader, but coming to it as a stranger, like you said, if it's printed on paper, then somehow it's not mine and I can kind of mark it up. So I like that too.
Okay, yeah.
Yeah. And I used to do it on color coded paper when I was a kid, I shouldn't say kid. When I was a younger man in college, I used to print it on particular colored paper so that I could identify what draft it was in. And I thought that this sort of linear process would be helpful. It really wasn't. It gave me a little freedom because if it was on blue paper, I'm like, oh, well, this is a piece of shit. I can just mark it up, and like I can rip up whole sections. Yeah. But now just the act of it being on paper is not a problem. And I guess white paper was so precious to me back then because that's what I would use to, submit essays and short stories to the workshops, and like the stuff that ended up on white paper was sort of the final finished product. So I needed that extra layer of nonsense to give myself the freedom to make changes. But yeah, I think just de-emphasize, for me, again, this is all for me, de-emphasizing the act of initial creation and demystifying the power of that initial draft. Because I read something recently, someone said that the only requirement of a first draft is that it exist. And I'm like, damn, really? Has it been that this whole time? Come on, man.
Yeah.
So like the faster you can blow through it, the more sustainable your process is going to be. I can sit here and say that all day and sound really smart and really wise, but I have not successfully adopted that as a, persistent practice yet.
Right.